The base screamed to life. "Unknown contact inbound." Then a voice cuts through the static. "I will not land unless Kestrel 09 is airborne." A ghost from a buried past. A legend no one was supposed to remember. Would you answer a challenge from the sky, knowing it could expose everything? The pre-dawn chill at Outpost Ravenwood was a familiar companion, seeping into the vast, metal-skinned hangars nestled deep within the scarred peaks. Elara Vance moved with a practiced economy, her hands stained with hydraulic fluid and grit, tightening bolts on an airframe she would never fly. The metallic tang of jet fuel mingled with the faint, acrid scent of ozone from the welding bays. Around her, the colossal machines sat like sleeping beasts, their silent power a constant, mocking echo of her own grounded ambition. At 28, she was an undisputed expert, capable of coaxing life from dead systems, but officially she was merely ground support, a shadow in a world of flyers. Her designation, Kestrel 09, had been stripped from her 18 months prior, replaced by the grim reality of a maintenance uniform. She remembered the sterile scent of the review boardroom, the way the fluorescent lights hummed with an almost oppressive quiet. Every tactical trial, every high-pressure simulation she had aced. Her hands had danced over controls, her mind charting vectors with surgical precision. But when the verdict came, it wasn't for lack of skill. "Reflexes incompatible with combat scenarios," the report read, its clinical detachment a cold poison. It was a sentence whispered to end careers, to relegate potential to the margins. Imagine that weight, the crushing silence of an entire system telling you that your best, your innate talent was somehow wrong. So Elara had found meaning in the periphery. Every morning she was the first to arrive, prepping the jets others would take into the vast, unforgiving skies above the obsidian frontier. She ran diagnostics on controls she understood better than most pilots ever would, writing training programs that pushed aviators to their limits without tipping them into disaster. And always she trained. Any free moment found her cloistered in the advanced flight simulator, piloting through battle sequences with a phantom precision. Not out of hope for reinstatement, but because a hard-earned skill, once acquired, demanded constant tending. It was a secret ritual, a silent defiance against the label that had defined her. One afternoon, Lieutenant Jax Seeker Riley, a keen-eyed officer known for his methodical approach to logistics, inadvertently stumbled upon Elara's private world. He had stepped into Hangar 7, intending to discuss upcoming simulation specs, when a rhythmic, almost meditative hum drew him deeper into the facility. Through the reinforced glass of the simulator bay, a ghostly green glow illuminated Elara, her posture locked, her hands a blur over the controls. She was executing a flawless twist recovery, a complex maneuver that most seasoned pilots failed dozens of times before mastering. Seeker felt a knot tighten in his gut. This was not the Elara Vance he knew. Elara powered down the simulator, the hum dying with a soft sigh, without so much as a glance his way. The air in the bay suddenly felt heavy, thick with unspoken questions. "How long have you been working on that?" Seeker asked, his voice hushed, almost reverent. Elara's eyes, usually tired and resigned, held a fleeting flicker of something sharper, colder. "Since the day they told me my reflexes didn't measure up," she replied, her words flat, devoid of emotion. Seeker's gaze remained fixed on her hands, how naturally they had moved, as if every motion sprang from deep muscle memory, not calculated thought. "That wasn't just good, Medina," he corrected, using her official designation. "That was better than the manual." He watched as she started stowing her gear, easing back into the familiar routines of her assigned duties. "A manual doesn't count for much when no one lets you turn the pages," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I learned to rely on instinct, Lieutenant. Problem is, instinct doesn't earn you accommodation. As she gathered her tools, Seeker noticed something else, something half concealed beneath the edge of her collar, obscured by worn maintenance tags. A faded, threadbare patch, softened with time and countless hours. The number 09 was stitched in silver, a squadron insignia clearly handled, clearly kept. "What's that?" he asked, his finger unconsciously pointing. Elara's fingers touched the patch without thinking, a reflexive gesture. "A reminder," she said, her voice thin, "of who I used to be, before they told me who I'd never be." She turned and walked away, her boots thudding rhythmically against the concrete floor. It was the practiced gait of someone accustomed to moving unnoticed, a ghost in the very spaces she helped bring to life. Seeker remained rooted to the spot, the image of her impossible maneuver replaying in his mind. A perfect execution under pressure. Instincts that fired faster than thought. Technical mastery that surpassed many of the active duty pilots he knew. If Elara Vance, the maintenance tech, was considered a liability, then the definition of liability was fundamentally flawed. He pulled out his datapad, the cool metal a stark contrast to the burning question in his mind. He typed a single, urgent note. Pull her full service record. Someone had either missed the truth or buried it, and Seeker was about to pull the thread. 3 days dissolved into the sterile glow of Lieutenant Jax Seeker Riley's terminal. The administrative archives of Outpost Ravenwood were a labyrinth of forgotten data, a digital tomb where classified files lay buried beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape. The air in his small office unit felt heavy, thick with the stale scent of old paper and ozone from his humming workstation. He had cross-referenced Elara Vance's abbreviated service record against every training exercise log, every personnel reassignment memo, every whisper of institutional anomaly he could find. The official narrative painted a picture of a competent, if unexceptional, technician. But the ghost of Kestrel 09, the precision of that simulator maneuver, gnawed at him. Someone had either missed the truth, or, more disturbingly, had buried it. His fingers ached from endless scrolling, his eyes burned. He was about to concede, to dismiss his gut feeling as an overactive imagination, when a corrupted file, mislabeled and buried deep within a subdirectory marked Historical Sim Ops, Unresolved Anomalies, flickered onto his screen. It was an aerial combat simulation, high-level tactics. The timestamp read 13:47 hours on a Tuesday, months ago. Official records marked the day as routine training, unremarkable. But what played on his monitor next was anything but ordinary. It began with the standard warm-ups, anonymous pilots pitted against enemy sim aircraft crafted from real-world threat data. Call signs were randomized, a sterile attempt to ensure impartial judgment. No names, just performance. Seeker fast-forwarded through the early phases until a specific engagement captured his full attention, a cold grip tightening around his chest. One pilot, identified only as Kestrel 09, locked in a digital dogfight with a simulated threat known only as the Shadow Pilot. The name itself carried weight across every flight academy, every tactical briefing room. The Shadow Pilot, in simulation, never lost. His combat record was practically folklore, his wins legendary. Pilots who went up against him returned from the simulator bay shaking their heads, recounting tales of impossible split-second maneuvers and tactical wizardry that bordered on the unreal. No one, not once, had ever beaten the Shadow Pilot. Seeker watched in silence, the rhythmic whir of his hard drive the only sound in the tense room. Kestrel 09, a ghost of a call sign, pulled off a sequence that tossed conventional aerial strategy out the window. Instead of clashing head-on with the shadow pilot's relentless, aggressive assault, Kestrel 09 stayed defensive, a phantom presence on the digital battlefield. She slowly, almost imperceptibly, coaxed her formidable opponent into tighter, riskier patterns. The engagement ran just over 11 excruciating minutes. The shadow pilot employed every trick in the elite playbook, pushing his simulated jet near the edge of structural failure in pursuit of an edge, of an opening. But Kestrel 09 met each tactic with moves that felt almost preemptive, as though she saw them coming before they happened. Her digital aircraft danced on the edge of destruction, always recovering, always adapting, her defense a relentless offense. What would it feel like, Seeker wondered, to face an opponent who seemed to read your very thoughts, to anticipate your every move, to realize that every strategy you had perfected was being systematically dismantled, not by brute force, but by an unseen, unnerving intelligence. At precisely 13:58 hours, the shadow pilot's aircraft flamed out, a simulated engine failure triggered by a reckless, desperate dive. He ejected, marking his first loss after more than 60 consecutive victories. The defeat itself was monumental, a seismic shift in the digital hierarchy. But the most unforgettable part wasn't the loss. It was the voice that followed. "Control, this is Shadow Pilot," came the transmission, staticky but unmistakable, tinged with a raw, disbelieving edge. "I need to know who that was." The reply was curt, official. "Negative, Shadow Pilot. Participant identities remain classified." The shadow pilot's voice, usually calm and composed, held a tremor of something akin to outrage. "I understand protocol, but that pilot, those moves weren't standard. Somebody taught them techniques I've never seen." Seeker replayed the moment multiple times, his hands growing cold. The flying pattern Kestrel 09 had used, the precise angle, the twist, the recovery, matched exactly the maneuver Elara had demonstrated in the simulator. He paused the feed, leaning in close, almost pressing his face against the monitor to study the telemetry layered over the footage. Kestrel 09's biometric stats were steady the entire time. Heart rate, stress levels, reflex lag, all within normal bounds, even while facing the most formidable simulation opponent in the program. Whoever Kestrel 09 was, they had just dropped the shadow pilot with near zero physiological stress. He pulled up the exercise logs from that day, comparing pilot assignments with aircraft data. Most names and squadrons were there, accounted for, except for Kestrel 09. Her identity was listed as classification pending, with a vague, almost ominous note about reassignment to alternate duties after the exercise. Alternate duties, as in logistics, as in repair scheduling, as in declared a liability. The pieces clicked into place with a chilling, mechanical precision. This wasn't a mistake. This was a cover-up, an institutional decision made to preserve a legend, to protect a narrative, at the cost of erasing a singular, undeniable talent. He found Elara back in the parts warehouse, hunched over inventory sheets spread across a metal table. Her hair was tied back, making her look younger than her years, despite the grease smudges on her cheek and the faint shadows beneath her eyes. The air smelled of oil and rust, a scent she had grown too accustomed to. "Medina," Seeker said, his voice hushed, the sound seeming to absorb into the cavernous silence of the warehouse. "I need to ask you something." She glanced up, distracted, her pen freezing mid-stroke. "If this is about the sim calendar, it's posted under Kestrel 09. The call sign, spoken so casually, hung in the air like a phantom. Her posture didn't change, her face remained neutral, but something in her eyes, a fleeting flicker of recognition, A profound weariness gave her away. "I don't know what you're getting at, Lieutenant," she replied, her voice carefully flat. Seeker stayed seated across from her, his gaze unwavering. "Training footage, 14 months back. A sim match against the shadow pilot." He leaned forward, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "That was you, wasn't it?" Elara slowly lowered her pen, placing it precisely beside her inventory forms. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time, Seeker saw past the tech and into the raw, unguarded core of her frustration. The fatigue, a kind of quiet surrender, etched itself onto her features. "Why does it matter?" she finally asked, the question laced with a bitter undertone. "Because I saw you beat the best simulation pilot anyone's ever faced. I saw you do what no one else could." He leaned further. "And I saw what happened after. They buried the file, shuffled you off to logistics, classified the whole thing." The truth hung in the air, a silent accusation. Elara had to make a choice: confirm the past or let it remain buried. Ilara's gaze drifted to the warehouse window, beyond the stacked crates and the scent of oil, towards the distant runway where pilots were gearing up, preparing for missions she had helped them train for. The hum of jet engines starting up was a low thrum against her chest, a physical reminder of what she had lost. "Because I embarrassed someone?" she asked, her voice tinged with a bitterness that Seeker hadn't heard before. She paused, then, slowly, deliberately began to speak, her words unwinding a tightly held narrative. "The day after that sim," she began, "Commander Thorne called me into his office, said my performance was irregular, needed further review. 3 weeks later, they decided my reflexes didn't fit combat standards." Her fingers, almost unconsciously, brushed the worn 09 patch beneath her collar. The gesture spoke volumes of a pain not expressed in anger, but in quiet, persistent disappointment. "You were too good?" Seeker asked quietly, the implication hanging heavy in the warehouse air. Elara turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't meant to be that good, Lieutenant. I was supposed to be the engineer who lent a hand with training modules. Nothing more." She continued, her voice gaining a quiet, chilling conviction. They needed the shadow pilot undefeated for morale, for recruitment, for the legend that holds this whole sim program together. The pieces clicked into place for Seeker, clean, mechanical, and horrifyingly inevitable. "So, they erased your win, buried your name, and reassigned you?" Elara nodded, her eyes distant. "They offered a choice: stick with logistics and keep my benefits, or face disciplinary charges for unauthorized participation in a classified event." She returned to her paperwork, her movements stiff. "I chose to stay useful." "But you held on to the patch," Seeker observed, his gaze fixed on the faded silver 09. Ilara's fingers brushed it once more, a muscle memory of a past identity. "Reminders matter, Lieutenant. They remind you what you were, or what you still are." Seeker paused at the doorway, the gravity of her sacrifice pressing down on him. "Medina," he said, turning back, "that twist recovery you've been perfecting. The shadow pilot tried to shut it down mid-sim. It didn't work." Elara looked up, a faint, almost imperceptible curve on her lips. "I know. I built it for pilots who think nothing can touch them." At 8:47, the base alarm shattered the stillness of Outpost Ravenwood. A piercing, insistent wail that ripped through the quiet routines, dragging everyone into a sudden, frantic urgency. Pilots rushed to suit up, the sharp slap of their boots echoing across the tarmac. Ground teams snapped into motion, their movements precise, instinctual. Elara was shoulder-deep in a diagnostic panel, the metallic scent of exposed wires filling her nostrils, when the loudspeaker crackled alive, its static-laced urgency amplifying the growing dread. All personnel, priority alert. Unidentified aircraft entering restricted airspace. Repeat, unknown contact inbound. Hostile intent assumed. From the open hangar doors, Elara could already see the scramble. Pilots sprinting toward their jets, flight suits half-fastened, helmets clutched tight. She had witnessed this drill dozens of times, always from the sidelines, an observer to the practiced chaos. But this time, the tension was different. It vibrated in the air, a raw, primal hum that settled deep in her bones. This didn't feel like a drill. She wiped her hands on a rag, the grease smudging her cheek, and made her way toward the comms center, where rapid-fire radio updates spilled from open channels, a torrent of clipped, urgent voices. "Control, this is Falcon Leader," came a strained voice over the comms. "Multiple bogies on radar, bearing 270. Angels 15. Requesting weapons green." The comms operator, a young tech named Anya, held her breath, her knuckles white against the console. "Negative, Falcon Leader. Hold defensive posture. Attempting contact with inbound." Elara heard the strain in Anya's voice, a tremor that told of imminent breaking points. One poor translation, one wrong tone, one misstep, and this could spiral into something irreversible, something international. The air in the comms center grew heavy, thick with the smell of anticipation and fear. Then, a voice, smooth, clipped English, touched with a faint, almost imperceptible Eastern European accent, cut through the frantic chatter. It was calm, precise, and utterly chilling in its unexpected arrival. "Control tower, this is callsign Shadow Pilot. Requesting permission to land." Every channel went dead. The sudden, profound silence was more jarring than the chaos preceding it. Elara felt her pulse stall, a cold wave washing over her. The Shadow Pilot. Not in a simulator, in real airspace. Anya, the radio tech, stared around the room, her face pale, clearly unsettled. "Shadow Pilot, identify aircraft type, intent, and nation of origin." The reply was swift, unwavering. "Shadow Pilot represents no hostile state. I seek dialogue with one specific pilot." The room, already tense, now buzzed with a low, confused murmur. "Shadow Pilot, identify the pilot you're requesting." The answer, when it came, landed with the force of a physical blow. "Callsign Kestrel 09, the one who defeated me in simulation 14 months ago." Elara's knees nearly gave out. Around her, glances darted across the room, puzzled, alarmed. Only she and Seeker knew the full, damning truth behind that sim. Just then, Commander Thorne stormed through the doors, his face flushed with disbelief, his authority momentarily fractured by the sheer audacity of the situation. "What the hell is the Shadow Pilot talking about?" he barked, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "We've got no one tagged 09. "Sir," Seeker cut in, his voice sharp and sure, cutting through Thorne's bluster. "I believe I know who the Shadow Pilot means." Thorne snapped his head around, his eyes narrowing. "Explain, now." Seeker met his gaze, unflinching. "Elara Vance, sir. She flew as Kestrel 09 in Exercise 1347, 14 months ago." Thorne blinked, his face a mask of incredulity. "Vance? The tech specialist?" His voice went up a pitch, a note of pure disbelief. "That's not possible." "Sir, I've reviewed the full recording," Seeker insisted, his conviction unwavering. "Vance beat the Shadow Pilot in sim combat." Seeker hesitated for a fraction of a second, then dropped the line that shattered the room's certainty. A cold, hard fact. It's the only time the shadow pilot has ever lost. Commander Thorne stared at him as if he'd claimed physics no longer applied, as if the very laws of reality had just been suspended. You're saying our logistics engineer took down the most feared simulation pilot in the world? Before Seeker could reply, Elara stepped forward, her movement decisive, unhesitating. Sir, requesting permission to speak. The room turned toward her, a sea of bewildered faces. The woman they'd written off as Falcon 09 stood calm, centered, sure of herself in a way that training couldn't teach, only an innate, unyielding ability. The shadow pilot isn't some simulation bot, she stated, her voice even, resonant. He's active military, former Eastern Bloc, likely from the Caspian front, judging by his accent. He's not here to fight, sir. Elara let the moment hang, the weight of her words settling over the command center. He's here to understand how someone with 0 combat clearance flew circles around him. He's here to learn. Vance, Commander Thorne said skeptically, the sound of her surname on his lips tasting like ash. You're suggesting we let a maintenance tech engage with a foreign military pilot. This is a national security incident. Elara met his gaze, unflinching. With respect, sir, I'm suggesting we let the person who already defeated the shadow pilot finish what she started. The radio sparked again, the shadow pilot's voice, patient but firm, filling the sudden void. Control, I know 09 is listening. Your silence confirms the pilot is present but not authorized. That's unfortunate. Before anyone could react, Elara moved to the console, her movements fluid, almost predestined. She picked up the mic, the cold metal a familiar weight in her hand. Shadow pilot, she said, her voice clear, resolute. This is Kestrel 09. I'm here. The pause that followed stretched long enough for her to count her own heartbeat, a deep, rhythmic thrum against her ribs. A single name, spoken into the void, bridged 14 months of silence. The game was on, but no one knew the rules. Ghost Girl, the shadow pilot replied, his voice carrying something close to relief, a faint echo of triumph. At last. I've been searching for you since our match. No one would confirm your identity. The hushed murmurs in the command center escalated to a confused buzz. Elara, however, remained calm, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces around her, faces that had dismissed her, overlooked her, and now gawked with a mixture of alarm and dawning intrigue. What would it be like to finally be seen? To have your quiet expertise called out on an international frequency? What do you want, shadow pilot? Elara asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the internal tremors that sought to surface. To understand. You flew in ways I couldn't predict, patterns that anticipated my every tactic. I need to know, how did you learn to fly like that? Elara held his gaze, her answer delivered with a quiet, devastating confidence. I studied you, shadow pilot. Every mission tape, every maneuver you used, every breakdown in the sim reports. I learned to beat you by thinking like you. A beat of silence, then the shadow pilot's voice, sharp with disbelief. Impossible. Those records are restricted. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Elara's lips. Not to maintenance with the right clearance, she replied, a subtle jab at the very system that had sidelined her. We see everything, shadow pilot. We're just not supposed to act on it. Another long silence stretched, heavy with the implications of her words. Then the voice returned, altered, carrying a new proposition. 09. I offer a proposal. One-on-one, no weapons, tactical flight only. Show me in real air what you showed me in simulation, and I'll leave peacefully. Commander Thorne moved towards the mic, his face contorted in a silent battle between protocol and desperation. But Elara raised her hand, a gesture of quiet authority, and to everyone's astonishment, he actually stopped. "Shadow pilot," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "What assurance do I have this ends with your exit?" The reply was immediate, confident. "My word as a pilot, and my pledge that certain sensitive footage remains buried, if you accept." Elara knew instantly what he meant. The shadow pilot had found the same archive Seeker had. If he leaked it, there would be questions. Questions that led straight to the cover-up, to Commander Thorne's office, to the heart of the institutional deceit. Elara turned to Commander Thorne, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the stunned silence. "Sir, I recommend we agree." Thorne's face was a mask of internal conflict, his jaw tight. "Vance, you're not cleared for combat. This is madness." "With respect, sir," Elara countered, squaring her stance. "This isn't combat. It's a demonstration, and I'm the only one here who's ever bested him." Thorne surveyed the room, his gaze darting between the anxious faces of his command staff and the grim determination in Elara's eyes. Every path forward was fraught with risk, none safe. The weight of command settled on him, heavy as lead. At last, with a deep, shaky breath, he keyed the mic. "Shadow pilot, terms accepted. One-on-one. No armament. You depart afterward." "Perfect," came the reply, a note of grim satisfaction in the shadow pilot's voice. "Kestrel 09. I've waited a long time for this moment. This time, we fly without masks." Elara turned to go, but paused at the threshold, a final request on her lips. "Sir," she said, her voice clear. "Requesting permission to use aircraft designation Red Wing 09 for this flight." Thorne, still wrestling with the enormity of his decision, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Granted." As she turned to leave, he added, his voice low, "And Vance, try not to make us look bad." Elara allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a confidence rising in her that hadn't surfaced in 14 months. "Sir," she replied, "I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to remind the shadow pilot exactly why he lost the first time." The F-17 fighter jet, a sleek marvel of engineering, shimmered under the harsh midday sun. Elara climbed into its cockpit with a grace born of repetition, every motion smooth, instinctive, a muscle memory forged in countless simulator hours. The aircraft seemed to respond to her touch, a familiar spirit awakening. Precise, immediate. She moved through the pre-flight sequence, a ritual she'd run countless times in simulations, but never once in an actual sortie. The smell of warm electronics and aviation fuel filling the enclosed space. The ghostly green glow of the instrument panel cast a stark light on her face. 09, this is Tower. You are cleared for takeoff. Shadow pilot is airborne at Angels 20. The comms crackled. "Copy, Tower," she replied, her voice calm, professional. "Red Wing 09 rolling out." The F-17 roared skyward, a beast unleashed, the sheer thrust pinning her back in her seat, forcing a grunt from her lips. Real flight struck different, heavier, sharper. Every stick movement, every subtle rudder adjustment mattered in a way no simulator ever could. The G-forces pressed against her, a physical reminder of the stakes. At 20,000 feet, she spotted the shadow pilot's jet, a shadowy, high-performance fighter of unknown specifications, almost certainly modified. He held position in a textbook attack posture, poised and waiting. His aircraft was an alien silhouette against the vast, pale blue canvas of the sky. 09, shall we begin? Came his voice, cool and challenging over the comms. Copy, Shadow Pilot, Elara replied, a steel-like resolve settling over her. Initiating demo. What unfolded next was 12 minutes of flight that redefined combat theory. Elara pulled from the same defensive sequences that had unseated him in simulation. But here, she recalibrated for actual physics, for full-speed vectors, for the vast, unforgiving expanse of real-world airspace. She didn't chase, she lured. Her maneuvers weren't aggressive, they were surgical. She exposed gaps in his timing, subtle weaknesses in his response, all without firing a single weapon. The raw speed of the jets created a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the cockpit. The shadow pilot countered with techniques far beyond standard protocol, a terrifying blend of American precision, Russian audacity, and European fluidity. He was a master, pushing his machine to its absolute limit, the roar of his engines a constant, guttural threat. But Elara had seen all of it. She'd studied every tradition, dissected every tactic, preparing in the quiet hours no one saw. Not for combat, but for understanding. Her breathing was steady, her pulse a rhythmic thrum against the G-suit. She felt the vibrations of the jet, the whisper of the wind over the canopy, becoming one with the machine. At the 8th minute, she pulled the maneuver that had sealed their sim match. A tightening spiral, structurally punishing, forcing a decision. Stay locked and risk catastrophic failure, or disengage. The shadow pilot, pushing his jet to a scream, tried to hold. But then, with a desperate roar of engines, he pulled back, breaking the lock, conceding. Exceptional, 09, his voice crackled, carrying true, unvarnished admiration. Now I understand why you remain a ghost. Your patterns are unlike anything I've ever faced. The words were an unexpected balm, a long-denied validation. Thank you, Shadow Pilot, Elara replied, her voice thick with unexpressed emotion. Will you keep your word? Fully. This flight never happened. The footage remains sealed. You have my honor. The weight of those words, a pilot's honor, settled heavily in the cockpit. Appreciate it. Safe skies, 09. A beat of silence. What will you do now? You don't belong in logistics. Elara looked down. The base spread out below, its runways dotted with figures watching something they could feel but not name. I'll do what I always do, Shadow Pilot. Whatever my country asks. The shadow pilot's jet peeled away, a dark arrow slicing east toward international airspace, disappearing into the vastness. Elara eased her fighter into a slow, deliberate descent, a cocktail of satisfaction and uncertainty tightening in her chest. She had proven her capabilities, but the question remained, what now? Would she be welcomed home, or simply acknowledged and forgotten once more? The landing was flawless, precise, by the book. Red Wing 09 settled onto the tarmac of Outpost Ravenwood with a whisper of tires, the roar of its engines dying down to a contented sigh. As Elara taxied towards the hangar, she spotted Commander Thorne on the tarmac, watching her approach with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It was a strange mix of disbelief and something that might have been reluctant respect. The entire base seemed to have gathered, a silent, expectant crowd. Pilots, engineers, radio techs, clerks, everyone who had tracked the engagement either through radar screens or whispers on the comms. The air thrummed with unspoken questions. She cut the power, The sudden silence inside the cockpit, a stark contrast to the distant hum of the idling jet engines and the soft murmur of the crowd outside. The canopy hissed open, letting in the sharp, clean scent of high-altitude air mixed with the lingering odor of jet fuel. As she lowered herself from the cockpit, she felt the weight of every eye on her. Commander Thorne stood before her, his posture formal, his voice steady. "Vance," he called out, his tone devoid of the earlier anger, replaced by a grudging professionalism. "Report, sir." Elara stood at attention, her flight suit feeling both alien and utterly natural. "Shadow pilot has withdrawn, as agreed. No weapons used, no damage incurred. Threat resolved." She took a breath, choosing her words carefully, each one measured. "Assessment. Sir, Shadow pilot is one of the best I've seen. The encounter proved instructive for both of us." Thorne gave a slow, deliberate nod. The collective breath of the gathered personnel seems to hang in the air, waiting. Then, Commander Thorne spoke, his voice carrying authority and a distinct lack of fanfare. "Vance, effective immediately. You are reinstated to active flight status. Full certification. Combat authorization granted." A wave of spontaneous applause broke out across the tarmac, a ripple of sound that grew into a roar. Elara stood still as it washed over her, a warmth spreading through her chest she hadn't felt in over a year. Not redemption, exactly. More like recognition. A quiet, profound validation of everything she had known herself to be, despite what others had said. "Sir," she said, her voice clear, her gaze steady. "I appreciate the reinstatement, but I'd like to request one additional assignment." Thorne raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Name it." "I'd like to build a program," Elara began, "that finds hidden talent. Personnel whose skills outstrip their roles, whose abilities are overlooked by conventional metrics." She hesitated for just a second, the phrase shaping itself in her mind. "I'd like to call it flight from silence." Thorne's initial surprise gave way to a thoughtful expression. "Approved," he said, the single word cutting through the remaining tension. "You'll work with Lieutenant Riley to implement it." Seeker stepped forward then, a faint, almost relieved smile on his face, handing her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Vance," he said simply, "this belongs with you." Inside was a fresh flight patch, a vibrant Redwing 09 stitched in silver thread over black cloth. Beneath it, in tiny, elegant lettering, "From silence to sky." Elara unfastened the weathered, faded 09 patch from her collar, the one that had been her secret reminder, and replaced it with the new one. It was a symbolic gesture, swapping out a token of memory for something that carried momentum, a promise of future skies. "Sir," she said, looking Thorne directly in the eye, the new patch a silent testament to her journey. "Requesting permission to return to duty." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Thorne's lips. "Granted, 09. Welcome home." 3 weeks later, the sky above Outpost Ravenwood blushed amber and rose, painted with the hues of a new dawn. Elara sat cross-legged in the dew-kissed grass beside the main runway, a thermal mug of now cold coffee in her hands. Beside her rested a carved wooden aircraft, hand-shaped, its wings etched with Redwing 09 in script so fine it demanded attention to be seen. Training runs returned in sequence, each touchdown a rhythmic thud against the asphalt, a symphony of machinery and trust. She watched them all, pilots she had trained, knowing what it took to guide steel back to Earth safely. The quiet satisfaction of her new role settled deep within her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. Updates from Flight from Silence. 3 more names flagged. 2 techs with uncanny mechanical intuition. 1 radio operator with raw tactical instincts. Quiet minds like hers, finally being seen. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am." Elara turned to find a young cadet, perhaps 19, standing stiffly in a formal academy uniform, nervous, eager, a mirror of herself from years past. "I'm Cadet Sarah Kim," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard about the engagement with the shadow pilot and the program you started." Elara motioned to the ground beside her. "Have a seat, Sarah. Coffee?" "Thank you, ma'am." Kim lowered herself cautiously, still clearly in awe. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Were you angry when they told you you couldn't fly combat?" Elara looked out as another jet descended, landing smooth and sure under the fading light. "Angry?" she repeated, considering the question deeply. "No, not quite." She paused, watching the blink of nav lights fade into dusk. "I was disappointed in the system, and a little in myself. It was the ease with which ability could be dismissed that stayed with me." She took a sip of the cold coffee, wincing. "Anger would have wrecked me, Sarah. Disappointment, though, that pushed me to get better." "But you never stopped training?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "Not once," Elara replied. "Excellence doesn't wait for permission. It just demands consistency." Kim picked up the model plane, her fingers tracing its finely carved lines. "My instructor says you're the only one who ever beat the shadow pilot in combat." Elara offered a quiet, knowing smile. "I'm the only one who beat him while being declared unfit to fight, Sarah. There's a difference." "What's it like?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Getting recognition after being invisible for so long." Elara turned her gaze to the runway, where the final flight of the day settled neatly onto asphalt. Recognition felt right, but it had never been the destination. My goal had always been simpler: to prove that being overlooked didn't mean being unworthy. "Sarah, do you know what the enemy remembered about me?" She paused, letting the silence build. "Ma'am, they remembered what I could do. Not my title, not my assignment, not what anyone said I wasn't." Elara paused. "Your enemies won't underestimate you if you never underestimate yourself." As if summoned by her thoughts, Seeker appeared across the line, a manila folder in hand as he crossed towards them. "Vance!" he called out, his voice buoyant. "Flight from Silence just added 2 more to the list. Good news. One's assigned to food service, perfect scores in trajectory estimation. She's been calculating orbital drift models for fun." Elara let out a soft laugh, recalling her own hours spent buried in flight data and airspace theory, long before she had clearance to fly. "Set her up for evaluation, Lieutenant." Seeker gave a quick nod and turned back toward the admin buildings. Elara returned her attention to Sarah, who was still tracing the contours of the wooden plane. "Kim," she said, pointing skyward, "what do you see when you look up there?" The cadet followed her finger to where dusk had deepened and the first stars glinted above the flight path. "I see the place where skill outweighs permission," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "Where results matter more than reputation." Elara stood, brushing the grass from her flight suit, a silent satisfaction emanating from her. "Exactly that sky. Anyone can reach it. You just have to keep flying when no one thinks you should be in the air." The legacy of her struggle began to uplift others, closing the loop on her own journey and opening it for countless more. The sky, Elara knew, didn't care for permission. It only cared for those brave enough to reach for it. And now, She was building the wings for others to follow.